But do I think there is a high risk of happening again? Absolutely, unless we deal with this very quick development of filling the information vacuum for nefarious purposes.
Very much for coming in, Brian.
You're very welcome.
Tackling disinformation seems very hard, especially when there are very influential people driving some of it. But tackling disinformation at pace, that's a very different matter. What do you think the first steps are when trying to call out, I don't know, whether trying to flag up disinformation online so that we don't get in a situation where people are spreading rumours and ending up in jail?
It's a very good observation, and I think that the critical period around after any incident of note is the information vacuum, is at the point at which something has happened and at the point at which things become clear. And in today's world, the digital world, the way that people promulgate and communicate is the longer that time, the more that space will be filled by speculation, deliberately placed disinformation, misinformation, which is in effect somebody passing on information, believing it's true.
Yeah.
And without any kind of counter element, that will develop wider. And I think when one looks at nefarious issues, there are 2 points around. There are 2 points around this. There is the element of what we call anchoring bias. Now, anchoring bias is when you first hear a piece of information. It's the first time you've heard a piece of information, and then you have confirmation bias, which is a generic view that you hold. Now, if that anchoring bias coincides with your confirmation bias, all that does is reinforce a view that you already have, and with no counter element, it can then develop yet further. And when we are talking about situations like the horrific situation in Southport that we saw, there was 65 hours before there was absolute clarity put out. Now that in social media terms, 65 hours is a long time for it to be filled and speculated and promulgated and reposted and spread yet further. So I think the key thing about this is how effective society is, governments, the platforms, the police, is around very quickly filling that information vacuum to kill that process.
So that means that the police now have to behave differently.
I think the police have to be aware. I think everybody has to behave differently, but I think in this question, the police have to be very aware when they are responding to a situation which has a significant impact, that as well as, of course, doing their first issue, which is dealing with the problem, dealing with the crime, is being very aware that the information is made available to all those people within the decision-making brain, which includes government as well, in order to be able to kill that. Now, in the end, the clarification came from a judge 65 hours later, which was the right decision. But they probably shouldn't have been made at a local level. It should have been made quicker at a central level. And I think this is the point in today's world, is the speed at which these things happen isn't responded to with a speed of response doesn't match.
Well, you're clearly right, because I didn't realise it was 65 hours, but that sounds too long. But I wonder actually whether there has been a change in attitude, because I refer to something that happened afterwards. It was in the middle of the week where Tommy Robinson put out, I think it was a tweet, about a killing in Ipswich in Suffolk of a woman who'd been out walking her dog. And he had said, or he'd amplified some information, but I think he'd said that we think it was down to Somali migrants. And the local police in Suffolk put out a statement saying that was not true. And again, it wasn't 65 hours. It was a much shorter time frame. So is that a good thing, do you think? The closing of the window, the gap? The closing
of the gap and the clarity of the information, it doesn't stop the spread of information, but it stops the scalability of the scale of information. And of course, then what happens, and as we have seen, there have been a lot of allegations about foreign state involvement and about organisational involvement, and that's just the nature of it. Which actually, in this, what happens is then you will get. We've seen claims of Russia. This was a Russian-driven operation. What we have seen are elements of the far right and arguably other states seeing what has happened and amplifying it and fanning it. So if you look closely enough, you'll see some fingerprints somewhere. And then there are elements like Tommy Robinson who will quite happily keep amplifying this in order to be able to sustain this level of hostility. But the cause of it was not coordinated right at the very start. It was an organic response to a situation triggered by arguably a post put out by a lady called Miss Spofforth.
Yeah.
And we will see how the legal system deals with that. But that is a new phenomena, if you like, and I think the immediate response of filling that information gap is still yet hasn't been tested and tried, and the cross society hasn't got that right yet.
Okay. Let's talk briefly, if we can, about the Online Safety Act. There are some people saying, well, it needs to be strengthened. Just listen to this. This is James Cleverly, who's a Shadow Home Secretary, rejecting those calls.
We also have to be very, very careful that we don't turn into an oppressive police state. The Labour Party have got a long tradition of overreach in terms of freedom of speech and civil liberties, and I don't want to see that happening again.
Do you think we need to do anything about the Online Safety Act? About we've been arguing about it over it for years, but would that help?
I think the Online Safety Act, I think what is important is that we get the Online Safety Act out, up and running, established and working, and then use what we learn from issues such as this and such as other areas to refine it and develop it. The problem at the moment with the Online Safety Act, it has been slowed down by lots of debate, as expressed by Mr. Cleverly, around what is freedom of speech, what is restriction of speech, what is oppression, and it is started to focus on this is criminal behaviour. This is about child abuse, child oppression. This is about terrorism. Let's get that in. Let's get that working, and then use the challenges where there is more subtlety around it, there is more nuance about it, to have a debate on the back of existing legislation rather than delaying legislation coming in already.
MI5 has been warning about the radicalisation of the far right for years. I know that the Director General, Ken McCallum, spoke to us about this back 3 years ago, actually. Are they across it enough? Should more have been done? Are the authorities across this?
I think, as with all things, and I'm sure Ken would say exactly the same, it's a question of resources. How can we do that? I think when you have organisations like the far right, as we are seeing them at the moment, and the type of radicalising behaviour that I've described, it's far more difficult to deal with that because we are not necessarily dealing with fixed organisational blocks that carry out activity that the police can penetrate in traditional terms and get information on and counter. We're talking about a far more amorphous organisation who can be energised in the way that we've seen over the last week. And therefore, to counter that is a lot more challenging than trying to deal with a sort of fixed organisational structure, which you can infiltrate, you can gain information on, you can yourself influence and control. So I think, once again, in the same way as you mentioned before about policing, there needs to be a revised approach about how do we understand how these organisations, how this radicalisation works. Because at the moment I believe, we are far too keen to try and attribute it to a fixed bloc. This is the Russians, this is the EDL, because we like doing that. As humans, we like pointing at a block and going, it's these people's fault. And in reality, when it comes to far right, it's a lot more challenging and requires a much more different approach.
Finally, from what you have seen over the last week, and with some of the perhaps lessons that have been learned in terms of the police, the judiciary, whatever, do you think, and I don't even want to countenance the idea of what happened in Southport happening again, but if there is some kind of incident and this all starts up again, do you think that the same thing would happen in terms of riots, or do you think that it wouldn't happen a second time?
I think if all else was equal, and lessons weren't learnt from what we have seen, and there was the same prevailing situation around the debate around immigration and so on and so forth, I think it is quite possible it could happen again. I mean, I think what we've seen post the incident, what's been happening in the courts, and to be fair to the current government, absolutely, they've been very balanced in this. Both sides of the equation have been brought very swiftly to justice.
Yeah.
Their trials have been televised. But do I think there is a high risk of happening again? Absolutely, unless we deal with this very quick development of filling the information vacuum for nefarious purposes.
Okay, well, thank you very much for talking to us, Brian. Hopefully that's a warning to people who are listening and people in positions of authority. It's Brian Lord, who's a former Deputy Director of Intelligence and Cyber Operations at GCHQ and the current CEO at the Disinformation and Cybersecurity Specialist Agency, PGI.